The gorge itself is this massive cut in the earth, and instead of anything supernatural or experimental going on, what you actually see is a group of elderly residents living down there in really bad conditions, like constant fog, damp air, and this weird chemical haze that's clearly been leaking into the environment for years. The residents are just going about their routines as best as they can, but everything feels slowed down and heavy, like the place itself is actively making it harder for them to function. A lot of them are visibly unwell, not in a dramatic way, more like long-term exposure to something that was never supposed to be habitable. So the movie starts, and honestly, from the way it's shot, it feels like we're meant to understand this as some kind of remote containment operation. But the way I saw it, it's actually just an abandoned retirement facility that got reclassified at some point, and nobody bothered to correct the record after that. But what makes it worse is how normal the residents still are. They've built routines. They move in groups. They check on each other. They know which areas of the gorge are slightly safer depending on how the air shifts during the day. There's no collapse into chaos. Instead, there's adaptation, like people trying to live inside a system that never updates its conditions, but still expects them to behave as if it will. Above ground are two CIA operatives stationed on opposite sides of the gorge, and at first, they present like observers, but over time, becomes clear their real role is enforcement of separation. They communicate constantly, but everything is procedural. Status updates, confirmation checks, environmental reporting. It doesn't sound like a mission that is actively solving anything. It sounds like maintenance of a situation that has already been frozen in place. And this is where the first real conflict patterns start to show up. There are moments where residents inside the gorge begin moving toward restricted edges of the environment, not in an aggressive way, but in a necessity-driven way. They are trying to reach better air pockets, higher ground, structural areas that are less saturated. And every time this happens, the response from above activates immediately. The operatives deploy enforcement measures across the gorge, floodlighting entire sections so visibility collapses, using drones to physically herd movement patterns back into designated zones, and triggering loud warning systems that echo through the canyon walls. From the outside, it might look like security protocol, but inside the gorge, it reads like physical resistance against movement itself. People try to reach certain points, and the environment and systems above actively deny access in real time. It never becomes a fight in the traditional sense. It becomes a repeated cycle of attempt and correction. Residents move because they are adapting to conditions. The system responds because it is designed to prevent movement outside predefined boundaries. And the result is this constant tension where human survival behavior is being treated as non-compliance. Later in the film, one of the operatives descends into the gorge, and this is where the dynamic becomes fully visible. From his perspective, it is treated like a controlled insertion into a high-risk containment zone. He moves carefully through the fog, scanning constantly, reacting every shift in movement like it could indicate a threat response. Everything is tactical, measured, procedural. But the moment he reaches the lower sections, the entire framing breaks. Because instead of encountering hostility or resistance, he is met by elderly residents who immediately treat him like someone with authority who has finally arrived to explain what is going on. There is confusion, but not fear of him personally, more like recognition of a role they assume he represents. They start asking direct questions. How long are we here? What is the plan? When do we leave? Can we contact our families? Is anyone actually in charge of this? And this is where the conflict scenes inside the gorge shift from environmental enforcement to direct interaction. At one point, when residents try to physically close distance toward him, again not aggressively, but urgently, because they are trying to force answers out of proximity, the operative responds with trained containment behavior. He uses movement control tactics, stepping back, repositioning, using physical presence and gear to maintain separation, forcing space between himself and the group. It's not a cinematic fight, but it is a controlled physical pushback against human movement that is trying to resolve uncertainty. And the unsettling part is how one-sided it feels. The residents interpret everything as confusion or rejection. The operative interprets everything as system management. So even basic human urgency becomes something that is corrected rather than answered. Back on the surface, the second operative continues monitoring, and their communication becomes increasingly strained. Not because of new threats, but because nothing is changing. The system keeps triggering the same enforcement responses. The gorge remains active. Conditions remain unstable, and the language they use becomes more uncertain over time, like they are reporting on something that no longer has a defined objective beyond continuation. And by this point, the interpretation becomes very consistent. The gorge is not being actively contained in response to danger. It is being maintained as a state, a condition that persists because every part of the system is only designed to preserve what already exists, not question whether it should. By the end, there is no resolution, no reclassification, no correction. The residents remain inside, continuing their routines under the same degrading conditions. The operatives remain above, continuing enforcement and observation. And the gorge itself remains exactly as it was at the beginning, unchanged, ongoing, and uninterrupted. And what stays with me most in this reading is that every conflict in the film, whether it's movement suppression from above or physical containment behavior during the descent, all comes from the same place. A system reacting to human adaptation without ever once stopping to reinterpret what those adaptations actually mean.